you subscribed to Outer Limits magazine yet? If not, you will miss out on the best articles from the best investigators and authors in the global paranormal field. Ronald Kinsella, his twin brother Philip Mantle, Peter Robbins, Mary Rodwell and Malcolm Robinson, to name a few, have all contributed to past issues. From Di and Testman, we have in issue 18, Ghosts. Who are you? Holograms, lost loved ones, or energy echoes? Malcolm Robinson looks at the ghostly boy in the garden and examines an image. Is it a simulacrum or the real thing? George Bishop reviews Dr. Irina Scott's Sacred Corridors, a book which examines the secrets behind the real Project Blue Book. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Roswell, Patel, Memory Metal, and the one and only Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and UFO cover-ups. Adele Casales Rocha and the Michelin Man visitations. Adele escorts us on a visit to the French Reunion Islands, located in the Indian Ocean, east of Madagascar, and a fascinating encounter. We look at bad UFO images, the Cash, Landrum and McDonald affair. We have a recall of anomalous experiences, and we search for the Tibetan tulpas. Paul Sinclair reports on a gigantic FT spotted over the English east coast city of Kingston upon Hull over the Christmas period of 2019. Over the Christmas period of 2018, while Chris Evers examines UFO reports which as presented in the local newspaper, the Hull Daily Mail, and gives possible explanations for these sightings. All this and much more. To remain up to date, then you should really subscribe here. www.chris0597.wixsite.com/outer-limits-mag. Be informed. Saturday, 17th of August 2019, the venue is the Pontefract Town Hall and their assembly rooms, with seating for 250 at ground level. This is a strictly limited number, so access is on a first-come, first-served basis. This fantastic venue is situated close to all three of Pontefract's railway stations, with the Monkhill station being the closest, literally a 10-minute walk away from the venue. All-day car parking is less than a 5-minute walk and currently charged at £4.50 for all day. Pontefract bus station is less than 2 minutes away from the actual venue. Saturday is also a Pontefract market day with many facilities available. There is also many sandwich, fish and chip shops and other types of food available, all within a 5-minute walk of the venue. Pontefract has also good access to both the M1 and the M62. It is with honour and some excitement that Outer Limits magazine can now announce the speakers for its 2019 event. To host the event, working under the banner title of The Closest of Encounters, as always, shall be Outer Limits magazine editor Chris Evers. He will present a talk on a subject relevant to the theme of the conference. Making his Outer Limits magazine conference debut shall be author and experiencer Philip Kinsella, who will discuss his own extremely close encounter event and personal experiences. Paul Sinclair shall be making his third appearance at an Outer Limits magazine conference to discuss more details of his investigations and findings. Outer Limits magazine associate editor Malcolm Robinson will return for our third conference, and he will discuss his new publication concerning the Bob Taylor Close Encounter, or as it's also known, the Decmont Woods Incident. We are extremely pleased to announce our very special speaker, making what shall be his first ever visit to the United Kingdom, to present his own story in a public forum, and this shall be the only remaining witness to the famous Pascagoula abduction event, Calvin Parker. Without a doubt, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime chance to meet and hear Calvin's most intriguing case, straight from the only surviving witness. Working alongside Outer Limits magazine is my co-host of the new Inside Outer Limits radio show. This is Philip Mantle, the publisher at Flying Disc Press. We are extremely grateful for Philip's continued support of Outer Limits magazine and all its endeavours. Tickets for the day event are priced at £20 each, plus a £1.80 PayPal fee, and are now available to order at chris057.wixsite.com/outer-limits-mag. just follow the on-screen instructions on the homepage of the website. And remember, we have strictly limited seating numbers, available to 250. The tickets are already selling. Don't miss out. Get yours now. Come be informed. Do remember, tickets shall be posted out, so please allow at least 14 days to receive them.
Hello there, everybody, once again, and welcome to another of Inside at the Outer Limits radio show. And, of course, myself, Chris Evers, as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Philip Mantle. Are you there, Phil?
Good evening, Chris. Nice to speak to you.
You too, as well. It's been quite a while, hasn't it, since we last spoke?
Yeah, well, I mean, we keep in touch, but, actually hearing your voice, I've not done that for a couple of weeks. Nice to speak to you again this evening.
It is you as well, Phil. It is you as well. So, this evening, we have a female guest. Do you want to describe her to us, Phil?
Well, that's pretty difficult, really. I mean, the lady we're about to speak to is a respected friend and colleague of mine. Adele and I have been in contact, shall we say, for several years now, and we worked on a number of things. And she is a paranormal stroke UFO researcher in her own right, and an author. And I'm glad to say I'll be publishing Adele's book on the 1st of March. I'll let her tell you more about the book. She knows far more about it than me, but that's how we know her. But I think, to a wider audience, this will be a good way of getting to know a different side of research and a different person. It's not the same old names all over again.
Yeah. Now, this young lady that you're referring to, correct me if I pronounce this incorrectly, please, is Adele Casales, is it Rocha?
It's actually Adele Casales Rocha. It's
Adele Casales Rocha.
Yes.
Okay. Now, that tells me a Spanish background, would that be?
Actually, that's interesting that you asked me that question. I come from a kind of like a diverse heritage. I am part Filipina from the Philippines, which is in the Pacific Rim, strategically right below Japan and across from China. And, to make a long story short, we're at the crossroads of Asia. But it is an unusual area because it is distinctive in terms of the cultural backdrop. We had been occupied by the Spanish for 400 years. And this is obviously before my time. Since you say young lady. They were there for 400 years approximately, and during that time frame, we pretty much assimilated as much as they've assimilated to our culture. And at the end, there was a lot of admixture, not just in cuisine, but all kinds of traditions, including religious beliefs and things of that nature. So what you have is an Asian country that is highly unique in the sense that it's more Eurasian rather than just simply an Asian country, which is typical of the area. So with that, there's also 32 dialects that are spoken, on top of the fact that we also had a lot of import-export with other European countries as a result of the crossroads that's continuously open between us and Spain, which still exists today to some extent. So the name comes from, if you roughly translate it, Adele was my grandmother's name. She was part Spanish from Toledo, Spain, which is right smack in the middle of Spain. And the middle name is a house. It's Spanish for house. Rocha is rock. So it's a house on a rock. And there's other reasons for putting that all together. It was interesting how I came about it. It was actually just in the space of a few minutes when I realized that resonates with me, because I wanted something that was stable in terms of, my identity. And obviously it is a pen name. But it's a name that seems to go together, so to speak. So, yes, my background is part Spanish and part Filipina, which has some Malayan and Chinese influence to boot.
That's excellent.
Yeah, I've got a pen name as well.
That's unprintable though, Phil.
Right, ballpoint.
I thought it was Roger Moore, but that's okay.
Oh dear.
But I worked with a gentleman from the Philippines, Adele, and his first name was Albert, which of course is not Spanish at all. But I think after the Spanish, the Americans were there for a while. I think the Brits were there for a while in the Philippines, and he echoes what you've just said: the rich, mixed, diverse culture. And Chris takes the mickey out of me because I have trouble pronouncing foreign names. Now, Albert, I worked with this chap for about 6 years, and I still struggle to say his surname. Tejada.
Wow.
It's spelled Tejhada, but, it's Tejada. It's a sort of a silent J almost. And so we had long discussions about the Philippines, and he still had family there. And he told me about the hurricane season. And he remembered one year, I think they had one hurricane kind of every week for months on end. I mean, it was unbelievable. But yes, it is one area, or one of the several areas of the world that does have a diverse culture. Hence, Chris, picking up on your Spanish part of it. You might know that that we have two dialects in Britain as well, Adele. We have Yorkshire, and then the rest of it. You might notice between me and Chris is a slight difference in our accents, even though we're both from Yorkshire. I'm from the west. Chris is over in the east, and we're less than an hour apart. But you can hear a difference in our accent.
I can. I actually can.
Well, that is correct, and don't forget that Phil is from the royal side of Yorkshire.
Absolutely.
As well, so.
We'll have to explain this to you, Adele. On somebody on a Facebook post once referred to me as UFO royalty. So it's a long-standing in joke. So now you know what it is.
No, I do.
It was called UFO royalty quite a few weeks back, just before we recorded some shows before Christmas, and of course I jumped straight on that and started calling him His Majesty UFO royalty, etc., etc. And it's kind of stuck with us both.
Yeah, but my wife gets fed up of bowing in my presence, though, Chris.
Oh dear me! Oh dear! And you still got all your teeth, Phil. Now, what I wanted to do, Adele, was you've described yourself in the past as a freelance travel photographer. How did you get involved with that?
Well, it's interesting how I came upon my various identities, and I have to say it's because I love to travel, for one thing. I've had a succession of cameras, and I currently own a Pentax, which I still have to unravel from its wrapping. But since I now own an iPhone, I found it to be a lot more versatile, honestly. I know a lot of photographers out there would not agree with me because they have to use shutter speed and they have to use some kind of a frame and et cetera, and filters. I don't use any of that. I have been traveling since 1982, and incidentally, you would find this interesting. The first country I actually visited was the UK.
Oh, right.
Okay. Oh,
excellent.
Yes. So I was there, but it was kind of like an official holiday. I had just graduated from college, university. I was with my friend from one of the dorms. She was with me for a couple of years. We shared a dorm together. She was very interested in traveling to Europe. So we took a tour, and I always said, once you start traveling, you cannot stop. So 26 countries later, I am still looking to see all parts of the globe, and hopefully, by 2025, I will have seen all 7 continents.
Excellent.
So
Excellent. Now, I didn't start personally travelling until I got well into my 30s. Not the 1930s, Phil. Got into my 30s, and the first place I actually visited was Spain. So that's why I can pick up some Spanish here and there. I can get by. I can order a couple of beers and a pizza, but that's basically about as far as my Spanish goes. But no, the reason I asked about the photography is because I don't know if you know, Adele, but I'm actually a photographer myself. I use Canon equipment and DSLRs, so that's why I asked about that.
Oh, that's a very, very nice piece of equipment. Yes.
Yeah, well, I've actually got 3 Canon cameras.
Oh my goodness.
I have 2 standbys and my main camera, which is a 7D Mark II, EOS 7D Mark II. I don't know what the American equivalent is, but because I know you have slightly different names across there for them than we do at this side of the pond. But yeah, I enjoy my photography, and it's something that helps me to relax, on a weekly basis. If I can get out, if the weather's decent enough, and I can get out and get some pictures taken. How did you go from being a freelance travel photographer to being a UFO author? How did that happen?
Well, this is interesting now. Back in the early 60s, and this is part of the book. Actually, the book opens with a little bit of history. When I used to live there was a story about a family who actually unfortunately encountered what we would consider a demon. And knowing the background of the country, having been through World War II, and the massacres that followed as a result of, that war, which I believe started in maybe 1941 or maybe 40 even.
We got involved. Britain got involved in 1939.
1939, okay.
Yeah, the Germans attacked Western Europe in 1940, and then of course the Americans were brought in after Pearl Harbor, of course, which was December 1941. So, and I do know round about that same time, December 41, early 1942. That's when the Japanese invaded the rest of the Asian area there, including the Philippines.
And so my family personally was involved in that war. There was a lot of devastation. My grandfather, who was a surgeon and a pulmonary specialist, was in a MASH unit. During that time, there was a lot of people who were being, obviously, not just military, but civilians, who were being butchered, killed. The occupation was pretty extensive. And when you look at that kind of a history, there's actually a lot of undocumented cases of what had happened to the Philippine people. That to this day, if you were to visit there, you will see there's still a lot of resentment towards the Japanese because of all the relatives that were lost during the war. My grandmother actually lost a brother who was garroted by the Japanese.
Oh dear.
The house that they built, and I will share this with you since you're overseas. I talked to Philip about this, and, for a little bit of there, I was very reluctant to actually share a lot of my own personal information. But I will share it here, being that this is on the other end of the globe. And since I'm about ready to close the book on the current career that I have, I'm looking at retiring in a couple of years, if not much earlier than that. The reason...
Can I just say,
go ahead.
Adele, before you go any further, the show does go out in America.
Oh, it does?
So it does, yes. So if you don't want to share it, you don't have to.
So I will say this. I have a pen name for a reason. And some of it is because some of the work that's in the book personally comes very close to me. And some of the situations there are very specific because the people who were there that recounted them to me, I am still in touch with. and some are here actually living in the U.S. So for that reason, I want to keep it obscure. I've kept some of the locales pretty obscure, although some of the readers that have reviewed it have kind of put two and two together and say, I recognize this little town that you're talking about. And I know exactly what it is. And I don't mean to have people driving over there and, you know, when someone talks about a specific spot and it becomes publicized, they drive over, they try and locate the home and do whatever they want to do. And I don't want that kind of, disruption in their lives, because they respected me enough and really relaxed around me to be able to tell me all these details that perhaps they wouldn't have told someone else. And I don't know, maybe I just have that kind of a face. But when I traveled, Chris, you asked me about photography. The one thing I did notice is that when I was in touch with not just tourists, but locals, I was shared stories that, you know, for some of them, they were reluctant to share, but when they heard my interest in it, they seemed to relax enough so that they then went into a narrative. It's tough for them to tell these stories, so I've also changed their names. I promised them I would keep them pretty much, very different from the names that they do actually have. But I have preserved the story to the best of my ability so that people will understand what happens, when something tragic occurs and repeat violence happens, something opens. And my belief is that we have several different levels of consciousness. And these consciousness sometimes manifest themselves to us. Lesser beings, as I would call it, would manifest themselves to us, not necessarily to our liking, and they're not necessarily the benevolent kind, because they are attracted to the negativity. And so that opens the book to just this array of things that happen to people. Some of them are actually a UFO in nature, and some are ET contact. I don't know what that says about ETs. I don't know if they're there because they want to examine us. For some of these cases, it was very clear to me that they wanted to take these people, examine them in some extent, or maybe just try and make contact to let them know that they exist.
Very interesting, very interesting. What do you think about that, Phil?
Well, I mean, what we found, well, I certainly have, and others, when you go to certain areas that have phenomena take place there, whatever you would like to label it as, I think you often find that if you, like Adele's just been describing, can win the win the locals over to confide in you, and they trust you, then information comes about all kinds of things that you were probably not expecting at that point. For example, many years back, my old colleague Mark Birdsall and I went to investigate a UFO sighting in the Yorkshire Dales National Park, and it was just a small village, and we'd got a letter, and we'd put a phone call in, so off we went. And when we got there, I mean, the village didn't even have any numbers on the doors, so we didn't know where to ask. So we just knocked on a door and asked for the gentleman's name and if they could tell us where he lived. And they said, "Oh, have you come about the ghost dog?" Well, we were there to talk about a UFO sighting. And of course, they told us the story of where these two red lights would wander down the village, which they classed as the ghost dog. And then when you got to talking to locals in these areas, it was quite clear that there was a whole range of phenomena. And they're given titles, these areas. In my day, they used to call it window areas. They've been called in certain places anomalous zones. And of course, today, the word that's more often used is portal, which is rather apt because that is the title of Adele's book.
Exactly.
So I'll give you some idea, Chris, so I know exactly what she's talking about in that respect.
Yeah. What I'm quite impressed with there, Adele, is the fact that you are willing to go out and change, not put people's real name in, because that to me shows integrity on your behalf.
Thank you.
And the fact that you will get more people coming to you because they know they can trust you, which is what we want, so we can get more information to people like myself who puts it in a magazine, like Phil who brings it out in books, like yourself who writes about it, and we can share the information worldwide.
Thank you. I try and help them any way I can because, of course, when they share information like this with you, not only do they want to be consoled, some people felt like they were being singled out. And then, why me? Why am I the one that's in this situation? There was one, and it's in the book, about a woman who ended up with uterine cancer. And this was in the context of a report that came across my way when I was still in MUFON. I was with MUFON for about 1.5 years. I trained in April and was hastily placed in the field, so to speak. Of course, my investigative skills are not as good as yours or Philip's. I pretty much call them and I try to get as much information as I can. And then when I can, I drive over to the area and try to take a look at what can be seen and hopefully try to be there around the same time that the person saw the event or encountered whatever they encountered. But during a dispatch report, this woman, who of course will go unnamed, was very desperate for an explanation. I heard terror in her voice. She was very frantic. Sadly, she lived alone. And I will tell you that the house that she lived in was in a remote area. It's situated towards the Canadian border. I'll leave it at that. And in that area, there was a forest on one side, a field on another, so that she was at least maybe 3 or 4 miles away from the next home. So as she calls, I could tell that she was trying to reach out to try to let me know that the story that she was about to tell was probably unbelievable but very real. It actually just happened less than, at the time, 12 hours from the first instance. And then the following evening, it repeated itself. But what she saw was what we would call an insectoid. It looked like a praying mantis, much taller than her. We're talking about a woman in her late 50s who either was trying to diagnose a condition she wasn't aware of, or maybe perhaps had placed something in her that caused the malignancy, and we'll never know because it was not investigated.
Right.
Yeah.
So, when you first make contact, or somebody makes contact with you, how do you go about actually investigating that kind of incident then? I know you said you call them up, you speak to them. Do you go down and speak to them face to face if you can, or, and how do you go about checking up what
Well,
they're saying?
it depends. When I was with MUFON, the case came across my way through an email from the state director, and it's usually within the area that is our area of assignment. At the time when I was there was basically just 2 of us that shared the territory. The other gentleman would go high up as far as the next county, and I was basically within the county. So when it was a rather difficult assignment, because sometimes it would come across my way at 6 p.m., sometimes it would come as late as 10. So when it was early enough, I would attempt to meet with them or rendezvous with them, being that I'm alone as a woman and one never knows what's on the other end of the line.
Of course.
And so I would talk to them in a public spot and attempt to derive some type of either video or photograph or something. And, that's very difficult to do. In one instance, I met the person at a diner, and they actually showed me a videotape, which they had taped on their cell phone, of the series of lights that were following them home. And this person, you could tell, had no reason to lie. The girl was working in a full-time job, so was her husband. Her husband couldn't come, but her husband encouraged her to tape it. And you could see a series of fixed lights following her home until you could hear the car door slam. She would come out into the driveway, and there it stayed stationary. That person ran into the house and continued to tape it through the kitchen window, and that's what she brought with her to show me at the diner. But it's one thing to report it to me, and it's another to actually follow through and upload it onto the site, which was part of my frustration. And then for some, it would just be a call. Now, when I left MUFON, it's interesting because we had this show that was a kind of like a pilot. It was called UFOs Over Earth. And within days of when it was aired, it happened, it was taped in the summertime towards the end of the UFO flap. But by the time it aired on the Discovery Channel, it was already Thanksgiving. We celebrate Thanksgiving here. And within a couple of days, there was a gentleman who approached me and started telling me stories that he would not report on the site. So, it became one of those things where it was kind of like a name recognition or a face recognition, and they would approach me and report to me. But then they would say, no, I really don't want to report this officially for one reason or another. So that's how...
Would you
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, would you find that some people, they're a little bit scared to come forward with information because obviously, we get the ridicule factor.
Oh, yes.
We get the other side where the MRB are visiting, etc., etc. What would you find would be the most, the people use one particular excuse more than any other? Which excuse would you find that would be?
They were afraid for some reason that they would actually be reported, in their own name, and that somehow it would make it to the local paper. And the area that I live in is composed of little small towns. And within the small towns, everybody knows everybody pretty much. Like the town I live in.
Everybody else's business.
Yes. And so some people have jobs that are a lot more visible than others. And I will tell this to you since I'm not sharing any names or anything, but I was actually called into human resources, which led to my departure from MUFON. I was told that I had a position that was visible. And so I left, and then from then on, I started just compiling all this information that I was encountering. Here I am with my camera. I just want to take pictures. Next thing you know, I'm sitting down to a meal with them, and they're telling me stories. Yeah.
I have an example of a similar event, actually. A young man who is both known to me and to Philip. First name Gary, that's all I'll say. And I do know he actually went on to he worked for lawyers, I believe, at one point, or barristers, and because of the position that he had investigating such reports, he actually asked me. We used to do a magazine together at the time, which was a paper-based magazine, only for the local people in the Kingston upon Hull area here in East Yorkshire. And he actually had to come to me and tell me that he had to have his name taken off it and have no association with it because of the position that he had, the work that he had, really. So it still goes on. It still goes on.
And what's surprising to me is that despite the evidence, and we had quite a bit of evidence here during that flap, And the director himself had indicated that, we had like a 700% increase just in that one time period of 2008. And it continues to a point, probably not as much as it did back then, but worldwide. But I think that people are very afraid. I think their fear has taken over their ability to be open to the information. And that's what I see the most on my end. And there's even a sense of persecution for some people to come forward and share what they've experienced. And someone who's very prominent to us right now, one of Philip's books, The Gentleman There, it took 45 years for him to finally come up with it, because it is that difficult.
Yeah, for those who are listening and they don't know who we're actually referring to, I don't think Philip will mind if I say that's Calvin Parker.
Exactly.
He's actually he's coming to the UK, isn't he, Phil, this year to talk
August
to us.
the 17th, and Calvin will be in the country. And, as researchers, we find this time and time again, that I think more often than not, it's the fear of ridicule, being afraid, made a fool of or laughed at. And I'm quite fortunate. I mean, I've retired now. I work in this field full time, so I don't have a proper job anymore. Come and join us, Adele. I know you'll be joining us soon.
Yes, I look forward to it.
I worked for the Halifax Bank for 16 years. It was taken over by Lloyd's, and they were quite the opposite. I mean, I even lectured at the building that I worked at. I had 1,200 people work there, and I lectured twice there, and even wrote a couple of articles for their sort of internal magazine that they had. So it didn't bother them, whatsoever. I wasn't in a position of authority. I was just one of the minions there. But they never batted an eyelid.
The minions are the important ones, Phil, because they get the work done.
Well, yeah, absolutely. But, we've come across it time and time again. Someone will say, well, I'll tell you this, but please don't use my name, don't publish it, and you respect that. And but it's usually, more often than not, I think, I call it the giggle factor. They're afraid of being laughed at. And I can understand that, but this goes sort of in peaks and troughs, because I remember, for example, when people like Dr. John Mack made his interest in the subject well known, a Harvard professor, and around about the same time here in the UK, we had Nick Pope at the Ministry of Defence, and I think that changed things because the media, not all of them, but the media in general, at that point, we're talking early 90s, mid 90s, took a more serious look at the subject. And I think when the people at large see that the subject is being treated seriously, then that in turn encourages them to either go on the record officially or unofficially, and of course, I don't think we're in one of those peaks at the moment where it's being taken that seriously, but I don't think we're in a trough either. If we think back to not this Christmas gone, but the year before, with the article in the New York Times about the Department of Defense's secret UFO study, I mean, that was unheard of. The New York Times was one of the most critical publications there are when it comes to the UFO subject. So, it does, the flavour of the month does change. And for another example, I was just reading an old magazine that we used to publish, Chris, and I had a piece in it, and it talked about Whitley Strieber, and of course Whitley's book sold in the millions around the world. It was an international bestseller, and of course he appeared on talk shows, primetime television, long before the internet. But what it did, it encouraged others to go on the record and say, here's a gentleman
Yeah.
He's speaking quite rationally. He's not a fruitcase. Yes, there were certain TV shows that tried to make a fool of him, but he never rose to that. I think that's a great credit to him. He kept his composure, and again, in our own little way, Chris, we're not like that, but in our own little way, where we treat the subject seriously and in a respectful manner, then people are more inclined to come forward and perhaps talk to us, and that's one of the reasons why we publish these books, why we have these podcasts, and so on.
Exactly. So then, Adele, with this gathering of this information, how long ago did you start to gather the information for what has become your new book, Portal?
That was actually early in the game, even before I joined MUFON. Sequentially, in terms of events, I started writing things down as early as the 70s. There is a chapter in the book that talks about an event that was something that was observed by several people. And it had to do with a family member who came home to the Philippines on a visit. And I'll tell you now, that was me, only to discover what had led to her father's demise, my father's demise.
Yeah.
Okay. And Philip knows this. I think you know this, Philip.
Yeah.
My father committed suicide.
All right.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, because of...
Really sorry to hear that.
Well, this was way back in the 60s, and it was something that only he could see. To this day, we don't know if it was a demonic force or whether it was a Mothman. We don't even know what a Mothman is. Okay, so we don't really know the nature of this creature, which appeared to me from all the information I've gathered to be discarnate. So here I am. I went home to visit. This was in the late 70s, only to discover all these things that I had in my head that was never verified was actually in black and white. During the course, and I'll wind back, I'll tell you the whole thing. It was never shared with me that he had committed suicide, number one. It was never shared with me the method by which he committed suicide. It was shared with me the number of events that led to it and the events that came after. Most of the people that have shared it with me are still living today, and which is why I altered all their names. But during this visit in which I visited my grandfather's house, my paternal grandfather's house, my father's father, this is when he was alive, there were servants in the house who were preparing the meal. And the house is very old. It was probably built early 1900s. Not to bore you with history, but...
No, it's fine. It's fine.
So it was coming to dusk. And, just like in the UK and the rest of Europe, we don't really eat our meals until well into 8 p.m. So, we usually have a snack time or a Spanish merienda around 4:30 in the afternoon, which I think is like your tea time. We have the same traditions. So people really don't sit until 8. The sun is still partially out around that time. I think the time when I visited, it was close to what they would call the fall in the U.S. So maybe it was getting a little bit on the edge of darkness by the time we sat at 8:30. The meal was just being taken out. There's a series of windows that face the dining table. The dining table can accommodate up to about 14 people. There was probably 1, 2, 3, just thinking off the top of my head, about 8 of us gathered around the table. Most of my father's siblings had already dispersed around the globe. One lives there in the UK, as a matter of fact. And as we were starting the meal, we heard a humming sound. And Philip, I think you know where this is going. And then all the windows simultaneously opened. The woman who was my father's sister-in-law had just put on the table in front of me my father's death certificate. And for the first time in black and white on the death certificate were the words exsanguination. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He had bled to death as a result of his act. And the date and time of death was there. That was the first time it was actually validated to me. The time she put that down and when I read it, something came over me. The whole entire room must have descended by 30 degrees to almost freezing. All the windows opened, and we're talking from one end of the room to the other, and roaches just flew into the room. We're talking like the swarm. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of roaches. I mean, you can feel them, you can see them, you can smell them, so they're real. And everybody stood up, was running for cover. The servants came back into the room. They were trying to cover the food and everything else. To make a long story short, that was when I decided to sit down and chronicle everything that I had heard from people, that I myself have encountered, and the stories that went after that up to all the way to the present time. I think the latest story in the book I just got about 2 years ago, maybe less.
So does the book itself, does it concentrate on these kind of stories, or is there a UFO theme to it, or is it demonic, or is it just anything that is strange and what we call unusual in this paranormal world that we live in?
That is a very interesting question, Chris, because in part of the book, the first encounter with a UFO had to do with a woman who was living in the Philippines. And I will tell you that there's a smattering of everything in there. We even have a story about a woman who lives alone who encountered what she thought was Bigfoot. So we've got cryptids in there. We've got elves and dwarves. We've got, I have my own sightings there of UFOs later on in the book. But there's everything in there. The first one was a CE2, and for people who are in the general audience, a CE2 is where there's kind of evidence, some type of physical evidence. The woman who encountered this UFO above her home, she was leaning against the window to try to see why it was as bright as day. There was a overhang, which was the roof of the house. And in a tropical country, you have a roof that extends well over the window because, you know, not only are you shielding it from the sun, you're also shielding it from the rains, and what we call monsoons. Yeah. So she's leaning over, and suddenly we've got nothing but brightness. She's squinting at that point, not realizing it was having an effect on her. And the next thing you know, she felt an incredible desire to sleep. So she then goes back to the room, promptly lies down, and the next thing you know, it's morning, and then she gets up, she's dizzy, she's disoriented. Her daughter comes knocking on her door because she obviously had overslept. She opens the door, and the woman says, "You've got a tan." Not to laugh, but she had burns on her face from whatever it was that she had seen the night before.
Now clearly, she must have been outside the building then to get this kind of burn or this tan to her. You know, you don't get that from sitting in the bedroom, do you? At midnight.
No. And she was at a loss to see what it was. that had caused that on her face. All she knew was that she was leaning, with casement windows, what they are. They tend to be rather deep. And in her eagerness to figure out what it was, instead of venturing out of the house, because she was already on the second floor, in her bedclothes, she had leaned all the way over to try and see what it was. And the only thing she noted that was different was that there was total silence all around her. Normally, when your windows are open, you hear crickets, you would hear frogs, you would hear all kinds of things in the night. This was dead silent, except for this light. But the light was also silent. Whatever was up there was also silent. So apparently she was exposed, not realizing it, and ended up going to the doctor.
I mean, this is straight out of Close Encounters, is it not? It's Roy Neary all over again, being burnt on his face. I don't know if you remember the scene where his children take the mickey out of him in the corner and say he looks like a 50-50 bar. I had to work that out because we don't have a 50-50 bar in the UK. No. I assumed it's dark and white chocolate of some description, but it's right out of Close Encounters. So, can I ask something, Adele? I mean,
sure.
This is something I get asked on a regular basis. Is how did you first become interested in this subject? Me, I look back, and I've always been interested in what we term the paranormal. So, how did you get interested?
I think I got interested because there was so much of it around me. The very first encounter I had that I had actually seen something of an unusual nature is I was actually sitting in the living room of my grandmother's house. And a few steps from me was the front door. And the front door would be open, as it is in the tropical country. The windows are open, the front door is open, you're allowing the breezes to come in. And it was approaching twilight. And that's when these things start to happen. Somehow the sun is a protection. Without the sun, we have anything that can visit on us. But I would say the first time I'd ever actually seen something that was not alive, or what we would consider discarnate, was at the edge of my eye. I distinctly heard someone running right outside the door. And we have a front door that faces out into a driveway. Someone was running in slippers. And when I say slippers, we're talking what the Americans would call flip-flops. You put your your two toes in between in order to secure the slipper. And people usually wear that in the summertime on the beach. Whoever it was running rapidly from the backyard down towards the front yard, which is where the car park was. And it went past the open door. I turned in time to see a gentleman who was wearing black pants and a white T-shirt. And it was in tatters. And he proceeded to jump over the gate, and his slippered foot caught the edge of the gate, and the gate made a sound. So my uncle, who at the time was standing right outside by the car, turned around and saw it. He opened the gate. There was no one out there. There was no one out there.
Very strange.
I mean, it's similar to myself. I mean, I didn't see anything or anything like that when I was a youngster. But my mum, Adele, came from a very rural part of Northern Ireland. And when she was a young girl, she told me the story of meeting a fairy, down by the stream that ran on the property they lived in. And I mean, she told me the full story about it. She told my children. So that was always around me, and it's fascinating to listen to that and compare the different cultures. There's no way where I was brought up would you have sat around leaving your doors open.
Yeah.
You know,
You'd freeze to
however, well, it's not only that, you might turn your back and you'd have no furniture left. But having said that, whenever we had a thunderstorm, my mum would always open the front door, because she said that at one time in Ireland, you know, a fireball came down the chimney and shot across the room and out the front door. So no matter how cold or wet it was, if we had a thunderstorm, my mum would always leave the front door open. So, you know, whether that played a part on me gaining interest, I don't really know. Could have been. I think my mum certainly had an influence in that area. And it was interesting when you talk about your late father and how he passed away, Adele. I mean, Chris mentioned Calvin Parker earlier on. For those who are not aware, Calvin had the encounter in Pascagoula with Charles Hickson in 1973. However, many years later, I mean, Calvin was literally haunted by what had happened to him, Adele. There was even members of his own family. He wouldn't tell them. If they knew the general sort of story of what they'd read in the paper or whatever, but he wouldn't go into it. And there was a point, and I don't think he'll mind me telling this because he has made it public knowledge, that he contemplated suicide. And he actually phoned up his insurance company, his life insurance, to check to see if he was covered for suicide, and he wasn't. So Calvin thought, well, right, somebody will have to kill me. And he literally said, I went into a local cowboy bar, picked a fight with half a dozen cowboys, and they beat the living daylights out of him, but they didn't kill him. And he laughs at it now. He says, because I'm so stupid, I'm so dumb. They beat me so much, I staggered out of the door. I was so disorientated, I spun around and staggered back in, and then they beat me some more. You know.
Oh my God.
But you know, his wife, you know, Waynette would tell me how it affected him. She said, for example, I mean, he's a quiet, hard-working fella. Will have maybe a couple of beers with his meal occasionally. He's not a big drinker, never has been. But she asked him to go out one day to collect some bread, and he came back a week later. You know, he ended up in some awful spot, and again got the living daylights beaten out of him. But it's how this experience actually affected him. This is what it was, and it's taken him all those years to learn how to deal with it. And I know it was one of the things when I was working on my first book. My first book was called Without Consent, and it deals only with alien abduction accounts here in the UK. And it was sort of, again, pre-internet days, so I literally travelled up and down the country interviewing people, you know, in person. And some of these were old cases that we already knew of. Some were not. They were brand new. And one of the things that dawned on me, it took quite a while. I wasn't clever enough to realise it at an early stage, that, you know, people like me weren't capable of helping these people. You know, they needed to speak to someone in a professional nature. And I don't mean, when I say professional, I don't know what area you would call professional, but I know there were times when I certainly felt extremely out of my depth. But having said that, what I did learn was that a lot of people were grateful that someone like me would spend the time and trouble to go and speak to them and listen to them and not laugh, you know, and not put them down and not offer an explanation either. because I remember speaking to one particular lady, and she'd spoken to someone before me, and she was quite surprised. She said, "Oh, well, the chap I spoke to before, he told me that this is what had happened to me." And I didn't, I would never dream of doing that. I said, "Well, what do you think happened to you?" And of course, it was something entirely different. But I did feel completely out of my depth at times. But I was a young man. I think I've learnt my lesson in that respect. Did you ever come anything? Did you ever have that feeling at all, Adele?
I do all the time, Philip. And when you say you feel like it's out of your depth, you could just imagine how I feel when they tell me these stories, because I'm really, not officially an investigator. I'm mostly a person who just listens and learned how to interview because of the career that I had trained for. I'm trained as a therapist, as a school counselor. And because of that, I try and eke things out of people. I mean, obviously not by force, because they share information willingly. But I think it's hard. I know, Chris, you had asked when did it all begin. It's hard to pinpoint. And I know for you, Philip, it is too, to understand where the interest actually came from. I know there were catalyzing events, synchronicities, if you will call it. I had some events that were actual miracles in my personal life. And something is cluing me in that I need to share with the world, that what you see and hear and feel is not all that there is to reality. And that pushes me forward. And when I meet people, through other people, they'll say, she has all these uncanny stories. You should sit down and listen to what happened, yada, yada, yada. And, she talked to, and then it all begins. And then they add on their own story. And of course, they ask me at the end, what was that about? What was there? What is it? These questions that they ask me that I have no answer for.
Well, one thing I did, Adele, and I never published this. It was after I wrote the book. And what I did, I wrote to a number of what we'd call abductees. And I just asked them, it's not scientific. I know that it was only a small sample. And I said, what do you think is the nature and origin of your experience or experiences, just depending on who I was speaking to. And I gave them a number of options, and it was surprising. Some came back and said, yeah, definitely thought these were an ET encounter. Some thought they were of a spiritual nature. Mm-hmm. Most of them just said, I don't know. I'm just looking for answers. That's why I decided to speak up, or to seek out, was to try and find the answers. One young man who lived in Wales, he said it must be the Russians, This has been a physical thing, and it wasn't pleasant for him. So the bad guys at the time were the Russians. He didn't believe that, but that was the way he rationalised it, and I was quite happy to leave that with him. That enabled. As a young man, I'll never forget. And he was quite traumatized by what had happened to him, and he was still living at home with his mom, and he didn't have regressive hypnosis. What he had to have was hypnotherapy, because he had nightmares about what had happened. So the hypnotherapy was to take away the nightmares. And by the time I wrote the book, what I did, most of the people that were mentioned in there, I actually sent them a complimentary copy. And I sent this chap, I call him Nigel, that's not his real name. I sent him a copy, and I got a letter back thanking me for it, but he didn't actually read it for about 4 or 5 years, because it still bothered him. By the time he read it, he'd grown up, he'd got married and started his own family. But it took him an awful long time to come to terms with it. But I've also seen it in reverse, Adele. I remember when I'm going to ask you about this in a moment, but I was part of the British UFO Research Association for a long while, and I was their director of investigations, and I remember in the northeast of England there was a case we had, and I sent a.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
That's okay.
I
Don't
sent
worry.
a young man who was on our list of investigators to.
We can pause. Hang on, guys. We can pause if you want to, and just come back to this little bit if you want to. If you want to get the phone.
I think it's off now.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Let's carry on this. Sorry to interrupt.
It's all right,
you,
mate. As I was saying, in the northeast of England, we'd had this case come in, and I sent this young man along. I want to say young. He wasn't, a teenager. He was well into his 20s. And then a couple of days later, I knew he was arranging an appointment to go and speak to this person. So I rang him up and asked him how he'd gone on, and he quit. He quit on the spot.
Oh, my.
What they told him terrified the living daylights out of him. And that was it. And he finished, so we never got to the bottom of that. So that was the reverse effect. Now, I know you said, and I've been having, the reason I'm going to ask this question, because I've been having a discussion with somebody about it as well, so it's on my mind.
Okay.
And you said you're not an official investigator anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what I would say to you is, do you think it's a good thing to be a member of a formalised UFO group like MUFON? I used to be MUFON's representative for England many years ago when Walter Andrus was in charge. Mm-hmm. And I've been a member of the British UFO Research Association, and before that the Yorkshire UFO Society. So I've been in several groups. But do you think it's a good thing or not if you're trying to research the subjects, Adele?
I think that's a two-edged sword. I think it's good in the sense that you get the cases as they're happening. So you're right at the forefront, of these things, these situations, which, like right now, I don't have anyone streaming through my computer telling me some gentleman just encountered something by a river. Okay, if I was, I would see that immediately because it's within my county or whatever, my town. The other thing that's good about it is you also get the benefit of all the information from all over the world. And you have the pulse because you're privy to all the conferences and, you're able to wear your badge that says you're officially this person. And now you're going to hear all these people speak, which you can, in one way, like if I were to travel over there and go to your conference, I still can. But I'm more kind of at the periphery now than I was when I was officially wearing the badge. The bad part about it is the way the people approach me when I go to a case. Okay, and I'll give you one in point, which terrified my husband. My husband does not like to dabble in these things. He's my total opposite. I'll tell him, okay, I got to go now. It's 12:30 in the evening, and he knows I have to go to work the next day. But I'm going to go over to this isolated spot by this barn and sit in the car and see if I see something that was seen 24 hours before. Mm-hmm. So that's the negative in the sense that if you don't have enough people around you, anything can happen to you. If you do interview someone on the spot, they see the ID, and the first thing that comes to them is, are they going to use my name, my area, et cetera, what's going to result from this? If I took the ID off and I'm just a storyteller, I just want to hear what happened to them, some of them are more relaxed. And then they'll tell me everything.
Yeah, so, I understand. Yeah, I mean, I was felt constrained being part of a UFO group because most of them have, quite rightly, I'm not knocking them for it, they have their own rules and regulations, like like you said, Adele, after one investigation, you had to upload it to MUFON's sightings reporting site or whatever it is. I just think it's me. I was always in trouble at school anyway, Adele. I didn't like being told what to do anyway. So when it came to UFO groups and saying you can't do this and you can't do that, I mean, it didn't always work. I mean, I was asked a few years back to rejoin MUFON, and I politely declined because, I guess I'm fortunate because I'm, knocking on a bit now. I've been around a long time, that things do still cross my desk. Information does come my way on a whole host of things. And I'm able to share most of that in one way or another by keeping the witness's identity and things of that nature. So, I was just curious because there always seems to be this bickering.
You mean within the organization?
Yeah, you're a member of MUFON, and somebody will be disparaging. I don't like MUFON. They are this, they are that. I know a couple of years back, MUFON got slated for having their symposium about the secret space program. But then last year they had Luis Elizondo make probably his one and only presentation anywhere in public, certainly in the United States. And of course, he was involved in the Department of Defense's secret UFO study. But, so I understand that, I've been on the organizational side of UFO groups as well, and it's not easy. You can't always win. But like you say, as an investigator, what's such a thing as official? I mean, if you look at, it's probably been one of the most prolific authors on the subject in this country, and that's been Timothy Good. And I don't think Timothy's ever been part of any UFO group anywhere, but it's certainly not done him any harm. So now, if not before, Adele, you will be able to rightfully say you are an author, and you can use that as a way of as introduction. If you want, if somebody said, "Who do you represent?" Well, I'm an author, because that is true. So it's a different world now. I know. Now, I know you mentioned you had other sightings as well. If I'm not mistaken, is that correct?
Yeah, I actually saw something that was close to my home, and I don't know if you know this. I had moved recently in the past 6 years. The house that I used to live in bordered on a farm, a pretty big acreage. And at night, it's pretty isolated. I don't live that far away from the old house, but where I used to live, there was a street that probably around 8 p.m. would be pretty much deserted. And because of the nature of my job, I would usually leave to go to work a little bit before 6 a.m. And that's when I saw these things. I had one, and it's hard to explain, and I actually saw it on Facebook one time, and I was pretty aghast and taken aback that someone had actually photographed, if you can believe the photograph. I don't remember the source anymore, but it was an actual triangle. And if you picture a pyramid with a dark band running across the middle part of it. But where that dark band is, you could actually see a part of the sky. So what you've got is a pyramid that's suspended in the air, and somehow it's free floating over a base of the pyramid. I saw this on a major road. And as I was approaching it, of course, you're mesmerized because you have no context. You have no idea what it is. And this was post-MUFON days. I knew I wasn't looking at a plane. I knew how close approximately it could have been. I had no context to compare it against, but it was over the tree line, and it was right smack hovering over the road. And as I was approaching it, and here I am, you know how we are, you're reaching for your compass, you're trying to get that in the seat next to you. You've got your moonroof, which I then opened to see if I could hear anything. And I was the lone driver. There's no passenger. There were no other vehicles around me. And this thing just started to get larger and larger as I was approaching, which suggested to me that it was stationary. I actually passed under it. And I looked above me, and it was matte black. The base was matte black. And then I passed it, and I looked at the rear view, and it was still there. I have no idea what it was. But it was not moving. It did not make a sound. It was just hovering.
I think I'd have ran in that direction, to be quite honest with you, if I'd have seen that. That is absolutely fascinating. It really is.
No, yeah, go ahead.
Go
no,
ahead,
I was just going to say, it's interesting how events happen. Sometimes I think they're correlated with the weather. We had a hurricane here, and I believe it was the one that devastated Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina. Just about a week after Hurricane Katrina had happened, I was once again driving on a different road now, closer to work, approaching a four-way stop sign. And there were heavy clouds, because Katrina was still kind of like, dissipating or whatever, but, school was back. People were driving on the road. It was very early in the morning, and there were heavy clouds. Out of a cloud, and it just cleared. So a cell phone tower is approximately 78 feet in height. I don't know what it is in meters. But they're 78 feet in height. And right above the cell phone tower, just across the street as I was approaching the four-way, there was a heavy cloud. And out of the heavy cloud, something broke through. And this time it had a definite structure, and both ends of it had a lighted triangle and a large triangle in the middle. It was very soft to the eye. It was very bright, but it was soft to the eye. Like if you were looking at a car that was approaching you, you would get the glare. You would get some kind of, you would have to look your eyes, avert your eyes from the car. This one, you could look straight right at it. And this time I was prepared. I actually had my compass sitting on the passenger side of me. Because there was drizzle and inclement weather, I had the moonroof closed, but I had it open in the sense that, it was all glass between me and whatever it was. So once again, it was approaching me, and it was above me, and this was less than 100 feet above me, because it just cleared the tip of the cell phone tower. It was making a rushing noise, kind of like if you were pouring water down the drain. And I looked at the compass, because I was now stationary at the stop sign, and it was spinning counterclockwise very rapidly.
Fascinating. What did you do?
Nothing.
Bluntly. You just sat there and looked at it?
I looked at it. I was admiring it. I was thinking to myself, I feel so privileged to see this. And I kept looking around to see if there was anybody around me, but it was so early in the morning that, once again, it's only me. And that's the part that's frustrating for me, Chris and Philip, because when I see these things, there is no one around me.
My complaint is my two experiences. The first one was way back in round about 1973. All I saw were two unusual lights manoeuvring across the sky, far up, like pinpricks in the sky. But there was leapfrogging over each other, or it was one light moving forward, then coming back half the distance and leapfrogging over the position it had originally been. So it kind of like leapfrogged across the sky. Now, back in those days, and Phil will remember this, you may know of this as well, that there was a TV programme on called UFO, which was done by Jerry Anderson, and this was way back in the early 1970s, as I say, and I jumped up like an idiot and shouted, "Look guys, look in the sky, there's a UFO." But the strange thing was, it was a cloudless night, no cloud in the sky whatsoever. It was an early February evening, so it was dark by about 4:30, which is why myself and a few friends were out playing. Basically, we were playing soldiers, and I was on a mound of mud looking up, and I shouted that, "Look, a UFO, blah, blah, blah," and it just blinked out and completely disappeared about halfway above directly over my head in the sky, more or less, but it was quite high up. My second experience, I was doing a sky watch. Going back to the mid to late 1990s, was down at the British Aerospace factory on the banks of the River Humber. The factory was behind us, and we was looking south, and we saw a light come down the hill on the opposite side of the river. Just like an earth light, basically. But it came onto the river, and I watched it go to my right, and I went to my friends, "Oh, it's gone." And my two friends turned to me and said, "No, it hasn't, it's going under the bridge, which is to the left." So it'd come down, I didn't even notice it split into two, and it went in two different directions. So that was my experience. So those you've had, I'm still waiting for that kind of thing to happen to me. Oh, fascinating.
They're very close, and it's interesting how close they get.
Yeah.
Because
absolutely.
They know they can't be photographed and no one else is there.
But isn't that always the case? Just when you want your cell phone, your smartphone, you want your phone with you, or you want your camera, a DSLR or something, and you just want that one chance to get that picture that will, finally put an end to that question, are we alone? But it never happens. It just never happens. I think it's really because when these things happen, we're not actually really ready for them to happen. I think that's part of the problem.
Well, is it not one of the things that you when you're investigating these cases, and you've had an encounter yourself, people don't do the things that you would suspect they would do, and the reason I mention that as well, because I've just, as I said, Adele, things still cross my desk. I've been talking to a lady in Wales, and she saw what we call now a flying triangle, just a couple of years ago, and she's been telling me about it. And this again was at very close quarters and right overhead. And Chris don't know this yet, but I'm writing it up for Outer Limits magazine. And she had her smartphone with her and didn't use it. And she's cursed herself to this day almost that by the time she'd realised what was happening, she turned around and this thing was, on its way out. She took a picture of it, which was useless in the end. But she said, "Why didn't I take a picture of it when it was right over my head?" And she was looking for an explanation as to why that is. And similarly in the real close encounter stories, people quite often don't do what you'd expect them to do when you read about it. And I remember one lady talking about her family having this encounter in Wales. They were there on holiday, and after it was all finished, they all went back to doing what they were doing beforehand and didn't bat an eye as if nothing had happened. A partner went to wash the dishes, the children sat on the settee watching the TV, and so on. When you think, and to me, it's almost like as well, when I read the stories about Bigfoot, it's one of the things we don't have, or certainly don't have much of anyway in the UK, because we don't have the landmass like the United States does and other areas, and the forests and the mountains to go with it. But you hear of these, trappers and hunters and mountain men out in the, the hills, and they see Bigfoot. Why haven't any of them shot it? No disrespect. America is known for its relaxed gun laws. These people have guns and rifles with them, but why have they never shot one and killed it? It's just an obvious question to me to ask.
I think they do try.
Well, I don't know.
May add.
Yeah, they may do, but it's almost the UFO equivalent is, why didn't you take a photograph of it? Not shoot it. I don't recommend you shoot it, but why didn't you take a photograph of it? And they said, it just never occurred to me at the time, or why didn't you look round to see if there was anyone else watching it, and this kind of thing. What I'm saying is when people, in general, I'm not talking about every case, Adele, but in general, when people have we'll call it a paranormal experience, they don't act as perhaps we would expect them to act. And for example, when it comes to the extraterrestrial side of things, following your book, for those that are interested, by the way, I've got to get a plug in. Adele's book is called Portal, A Lifetime of Paranormal Experiences. It will be published by Flying Disc Press on March the 1st. But following that, a couple of months after that, is a book called Hypercivilizations, an answer to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And this is by Dr. Dan Farkas from Romania. And one of the things that puzzled him about his research, Adele, was not why the witnesses do certain things, but why he calls them the euphonauts, the beings, the aliens, whatever you want to call them. Why do they seem to sometimes do such stupid things? And he thinks his explanation, hypercivilizations, is the answer to it. Can I ask you a question, Adele?
Sure.
Again, it's something that always puzzles me, if you like, or still intrigues me.
Well, very puzzling.
Yeah, I mean, no disrespect. You are a female, and all females are puzzling to me.
Hey, now, Philip. I know you're UFO royalty, but you're not getting away with that.
Well, no. This is a question that knights pose.
What I was going to say, when we talk about the paranormal on one hand, and cryptozoology in another one, and then ufology in another one, and they're all pigeonholed, are they all in different pigeonholes, or are we looking at the same phenomena but perhaps different sides of the same coin? In other words, is there a link to all of this, or are they indeed something separate?
You want me to answer that question? Is that correct?
I'd like your opinion. Yes.
Well, if you can do it in 29 minutes, you've got plenty of time to go ahead.
I do tend to talk, so I will say this. After not to disclose my age, but I would say more than 40 years of seeing this kind of stuff and hearing about this kind of stuff. And I just had one that came across my way just a few weeks ago, and I'm adding it to my list. It seems to me, and it's a multiverse, number one, not a universe, which translates to so many different angles of existence. And I know, Philip, you and I have talked before about reincarnation and lifetimes before this one, the one before that. And I know you're not a believer in that respect, and I respect that. I think what we're seeing is increasingly a revelation of the panoply of creation and how complex and how many levels of that there actually is, that it is just simply unbelievable, incredible. When you talk about the paranormal, as in ghosts or demons, discarnate entities, they're not really that discrete in some respects to some of the ETs that we see. what I mean by that is that there's an overlap between discarnate entities who used to be beings that inhabited a body and ETs that are advanced enough that they no longer need a body. So where we are, and I am not an expert, I just read a lot. Okay, I'm well acquainted with the works of a woman, and I don't know if you're familiar with her, Dolores Cannon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to say her name because I respect her very highly. That is one realm I would love to be able to delve in and be trained in for the remainder of my life, is to actually engage in hypnosis and bring someone back to the encounter and a lifetime before that. And within the series of books that Dolores Cannon has written, she shares with us more than 3,000 cases of these encounters, telepathic communication with these beings, where they be ET or perhaps beings that used to have a body. I discovered in my own summation that we are at the very edge of the universe or the multiverse. And we only probably see and hear and feel about 1/34 of the actual reality that is out there. Because we are in a dense level of reality, we are only in 3D. We are so limited in what we can experience. But I think that because of that, we're constantly being pushed forward in one way or another to try to reach out and understand the other parts of reality that we cannot experience.
It's fascinating because I know a number of years back, you're probably aware of him it's more in the States than here in the UK. There's a Japanese American called Dr. Michio Kaku.
Yes.
And I met him and interviewed him. He had a book out called Hyperspace. And I went to interview him when he was here in the UK doing a book tour. I managed to grab him for an hour at his hotel in Manchester, of all places. And he talked about, even then, this will probably be, I don't know, a mid-90s time. I can't remember the date. But he talked about other dimensions. And he even gave, he said there were, I think he said 10. There was a number of different dimensions and parallel universes and all this kind of thing. And he put it all in layman's term. I mean, he had to, you know. And he gave an example. He says, I had a cosmologist come visit me, Philip, from Russia. And, you know, this is a time, he said, even though he was a scientist, he was broke. He didn't have much money. And he said, I took him to a casino. I think he only had $10, so he put $10 on one particular number on the roulette wheel. And Dr. Kaku said, well, don't you think you ought to hedge your bets? Perhaps put $5 on this one and $5 on another, or something of that nature. And this Russian professor said, no, he said, because I know in one reality I'll be a winner. so you know, I thought, well, I never thought about that. You can't lose, can you? You know, and it really did make you scratch your head, because this was a time when people weren't really talking in scientific circles about other dimensions and, you know, bending space and time and that kind of thing as a way of traveling through the universe. I mean, a friend of mine in Florida has recently sent me documentation that I've read, and it's all bona fide that, just for example, you talk about multiverses, just in our own universe, and this is the visible universe, there are 2 trillion galaxies. I mean, it is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And that's in the visible universe. And if you then compound that with, as you were talking about, multiverses, I don't think not only you and I have difficulty in getting to grasp with that. I think even some of the smartest minds in the world have a difficulty in grasping it as well. But I do tend to agree with you in some respects, Adele, that whatever this phenomena is, and I'll use that as a blanket statement, it is, I think, it's not the right phrase to call it paranormal, because it's not. It's part and parcel of existence. It's just that we are incapable at the moment of grasping it all the time. Yes. And we see whispers of it. Having said that, a chap I was on very good terms with and was very friendly with, he came and stayed with me a couple of times, was the late Bud Hopkins. Mm-hmm. I mean, the people out there will probably know of Bud's work in alien abductions, and he wrote several books on the subject. He was of the opposite opinion, that UFOs were in one pigeonhole and the paranormal was somewhere else, and never the twain shall cross. I remember he even wrote an article, I believe it was for the MUFON Journal, and he called it Stewpot Thinking. So he was in the other camp. But it's just something I find fascinating, because what is also coming up in Dr. Farkas's next book, Hypercivilizations, he is of the opinion that all this is related, but we are interacting with an extraterrestrial species, or whatever you want to call it. But they are so far in advance of us that we just will never be able to make any sense of it. That's why when we share these encounters, they appear to be doing something extremely stupid to us. And they're not. It's just that we cannot comprehend it. And he gives an example he says, you could take a flat screen television and put it on an ant's nest, and the ants could crawl all over it and would be aware of its presence, but never in a zillion years will they ever be able to figure out what it is, and we on a celestial scale are the proverbial ant's nest, So, it's something I like to ask researchers about this type of thing, because we all have different opinions of it. I mean, I personally look up, I'm not a great believer in life after death and such a thing. But I'm open-minded. We're all going to find out about that one day, aren't we, Adele? That is certainty. And it's one of the. We go back to when I asked you the question about whether you should be part of a UFO group or not. For example, when I was part of the British UFO Research Association, they had a moratorium on the use of hypnosis. So if you were part of Bufora or one of their investigators, you were not allowed to use regressive hypnosis in your investigations. And I stuck to that. I didn't break that rule. But what I did, independently, I went and sat in as an observer on a couple of sessions. And I didn't make any comments. I didn't ask any questions. I was just there as an observer. And I found it enlightening. And then a few years ago, I actually went under hypnosis myself for two reasons. One, I had problems sleeping. And I found a gentleman who lived not far from where I do, who was highly recommended. And I was just curious again about hypnosis, because most people's version of hypnosis is the entertainer on the TV, get somebody to lay a square egg or whatever, And I can honestly say, when I was under hypnosis, I was sitting in a nice leather chair, not an electric chair, but an electrically powered chair. I wasn't in old Sparky, you know what I mean?
You'd be roasted.
And you could alter the chairs so you were at your most comfortable, and a little headset on so I could hear to the hypnotist talking to me, and there were no outside noise, and I had a little attachment on my finger that was linked up to the computer. And when I was under hypnosis, I actually felt like I was floating. I could not feel the chair underneath me at all, Adele. It was, and it was there, but I could not feel it. The best way I can describe it as being in the most comfortable position I've ever been in, you know. And what intrigued me was, again, I'm not plugging this, but it just comes to mind when I was speaking to Calvin Parker about his experience, and he was on board the UFO. He felt, and it wasn't lying flat; it was at an angle. He felt he was in some kind of chair or examining thing, but he couldn't feel anything underneath him. He felt like it was floating, and that sort of stuck in my mind. So, you know, we never at Buford we never used hypnosis. But having said that, one of the things we did get with Calvin in 1993, he underwent regressive hypnosis with Bud Hopkins, and we got a copy of the tape, and it's fascinating to listen to it. It's all transcribed in his book. Now, when they're driving to the encounter site, they were going fishing on the Pascagoula River. Calvin will tell you that on the way in, they passed another car, and he could remember it was a red Pontiac. And there was a gentleman who was in the back seat, and a woman was in the front, and this gentleman got out. And then as they went further on, he believed he heard it starting up and driving away. Under hypnosis, he recounts exactly the same, but not only that, he can tell you the number plate. Whereas before he couldn't. And he actually gives you the license plate number. And the tag. You have a thing called a tag, I learned on American license plates, to donate which state you're from. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, and he could see the tag on it as well. You have no idea, Adele, how long I scratched my head to try and figure out what a tag was on your number plate, because we don't have anything like that here at all, you know. So let's go back to your book. I'm sorry to take up your time.
No, it's okay. I wanted to say that it's interesting that you mentioned how under hypnosis, Calvin actually remembered more detail than he did in wakefulness. And it goes back to the idea of that multiverse or the multi-consciousness. To me, and this is just, I don't know if this is just my personal theory or maybe this is also shared by other people. I think that because we're in a physical body and we're in a physical brain, our consciousness is restricted by the capacity of that density, that body that we have. When you are unfettered, which you are when you're under hypnosis, it's only basically your consciousness, your senses are heightened and your memory is more all-encompassing. It can remember more everything that you have ever experienced within that moment. And I think that's why he remembered the details that he couldn't before. And some people probably would argue, oh, no, it's probably because he was in a state of shock or maybe denial, and that's why he couldn't remember it in wakefulness. But now that you've got him relaxed and he's in this state, then he remembers. You can argue that part of it as well. But my thinking is that unrestricted by the human body, which you know is limited. It's got a limited duration, just like a car. After so many miles, it's done.
Tell me about it.
You then will recall all the other events that you probably in wakefulness don't remember, and all the details that you have become fogged up. You know, and life takes over. You're doing all these busyness. But if you weren't within that brain, you weren't encased in that physical brain, you would remember more. That's just my 2 cents.
I mean, we do know that everything we hear, see, perceive through our senses, we collect it all. It's just that we don't remember it all. I mean,
Right.
that's what I say to my wife. I say, I know everything. I just can't remember most of it.
And then here's the other piece that I wanted to say in the last minutes that we have here, that with all this, with the ETs and the scarlet beings, whatever their nature it is, they are more advanced than us. Yes, I agree with that. But they also have the capacity to influence events because of that, because they can manipulate time, because and I think you've heard me, Philip, talk about thought forms before. And there is one topic in the book, one chapter in my book, that talks about the influence of a tulpa, or the creation of a tulpa, which is a thought form. That's a topic for a different day, obviously. But we have the capacity, just like the ETs, in more highly developed form, and these beings in a higher level of consciousness, to influence events. So there's a religious undertone to that, which I will not delve into as well, because that's going to take another hour. But in the universe that we're in, we are what I would think, in my opinion, my humble opinion, co-creators. We can influence the turn of events to a certain point. Some people who are religious do that by prayer. And you've seen me on Facebook talking about, I'll pray for you, or my intention, or I want something to manifest. I think the ETs have that capacity to a very developed extent. And maybe I wouldn't even be surprised that when they, for example, visited Calvin, that maybe they're not physically manifesting as much as they're there from a distance visiting him, and maybe he bodily was taken, or maybe it was his consciousness that was taken. I don't know all the details of the case, obviously, but that's just my conjecture. Because I think, to me, if I were the advanced civilization, I would be more concerned about their spiritual development rather than their technology. I would be more concerned about the nature of what they're doing to the planet that they're inhabiting. And how would I influence them? I would influence them by thought, because they all can telepathically communicate, as you can see, without moving their lips, without actually physically being there. I think they can reach us from a distance.
Yeah, well, my mum could do that. My mum knew if I'd been up to mischief, even though she hadn't seen it, Adele. So I would have to agree 1,000%. Even as I got older, she could still figure out what I'd been up to.
Tell me, mother, that couldn't, Phil.
No, it has often intrigued me about the human consciousness, because even today, neuroscientists can't point to a place in the brain and say that's where your consciousness is stored. They know parts of the brain do this, that, and the other, but not human consciousness. Where is it? And I've long since speculated, because I'm not a specialist in this area, that whatever we term as human consciousness is not restricted to our own cranium. That it could be, for example, like a magnet. It gives out a magnetic, and it can influence and interact with other things. And I came about that by and again, I'm not a great believer in life after death, but this was a near-death experience where a gentleman had seen his wife sitting in the hallway waiting to see him. He was in a room on his own, but he was actually dead. He died, and he floated up to the ceiling, and he could only see her, through a window at the top of the room. And okay, yeah, he might have known. But the thing that he described, she'd actually bought a new hat that day to come and visit him, to cheer him up, and he described the new hat. There's no way on earth he could have seen it. It just did not exist. So, I'm not one about, the soul leaving the body or anything like this. I think it's more related to the human consciousness. And But that's just my opinion. You know, I was interested in for a while in things called crisis apparitions, where usually a parent will sense that something's happened to one of their family members, usually a sibling, but they're far away. And, you know, or it can happen between twins. Chris and I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Philip Kinsella. We got the right one, Chris? Was it Philip?
That's correct.
And he's a twin with his brother Ronald. And I asked him if he'd had any of these sort of twin experiences where they know what each other is thinking or anything like that. And but in his instance, there was nothing there. But so it is curious. It really is curious when it comes to human consciousness. And I think that's certainly a field of scientific exploration that is going to be expanded, shall we say, as the years progress. Whether I'll be around to see the results of it, I don't know, but I hope so.
In my book, Philip, you'll always be around.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, if you think whether you're a creationist or you believe in, you know, Darwin and evolution and whatever, none of us can be destroyed. You can't. We're all here in one form or another. You know, we can only be changed. You know, you can never destroy anything. You know, you can only change it. Like water. Water exists in various forms. It's liquid, it's gas, and it's a solid, but it's still water. You know.
I love that analogy.
Well, it is.
That is so on point.
Yeah, it's H2O. No matter which form you look at it, it's H2O. It's water. So nothing can be destroyed. You know, we go on forever. We are all stardust in that respect. So how long have we got, Chris, left? 10 minutes?
We've got about five minutes.
In 5 minutes, Adele, give us a quick sort of précis, an overview of what the readers can expect to find in your book, Portal, A Lifetime of Paranormal Experiences.
This book is in chronological order according to experiences of various people. It's distinctly different from other paranormal books and UFO books in that it looks at an Asian country that's, you know, therefore before obscure. The experiences there come from people who are just regular people like you and I, who have encountered not just discarnate entities, but visitations from ETs. And then it moves on to actually a totally different country and then into another country. But I think what unites it is the fact that there are people there who, in the normal course of life, encounter something that is unexplained. And the book gives a flavor of different types of encounters, not just with ghosts or demons or entities from another universe, but also cryptids. So there's a few stories that have to do with a shadow person. I mentioned to you a thought form that was created by a woman who was very lonely. There's also elves and dwarves. Later on in the book, there's a suggestion of something that was not explainable, that was hovering over a lake, which incidentally is just 30 minutes away from where I am. So there's all kinds of unknown, very bizarre things. There's also things that point to the occurrence of a miracle. So it's not all negative or bizarre or on the edge or evil. There's also some positive things that are happening to people. You know, their reactions are all very different, as you will read in the book. You know, I had a case where, and this was just recent, Philip, this was in the past summer when I was in France, where there was a family who encountered a spirit that was standing on a balcony. And this was in a heavily populated area. And what they took away from it was that whatever that spirit was trying to help them in their quest. And in their case, it was just simply trying to expose their child to music. to the opera and things of that nature, to, the culture of the area. But it left, as it does with all these people, all these witnesses and experiencers, it leaves an indelible mark that is permanent, that will always be there, that has altered their perception of reality, the way they approach things, and their beliefs are completely altered by the experience. So basically, that is the book.
And that, to me, sounds like one that's most definitely worth getting. Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed this evening. So, Adele, I'm not going to say goodbye just yet. I'm going to say thank you for that. I'm sure Philip has got one or two more things he'd like to mention to you as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would, again, I would just like to thank you for your time, Adele. I mean, again, March the 1st was publication date of the book. And one of the things I try to do, and I think we have succeeded in that respect with your book, Adele, is yes, it's I call it a paranormal book, but it is different, and it gives access to not just case histories but other people's perspectives as well, from a different region of the world that perhaps we don't hear that much about. In this instance, an Asian country, the Philippines, and. So, it's one of the things, when I started Flying Disc Press, this was one of my, hopes that I'd be able to achieve, is to make information available about this phenomenon from different parts of the world, and not the ones that we're all used to. Not that I'm saying there's nothing wrong with that, but I think we've achieved that time and time again, and of course we've achieved it again with your book, Portal. And I'm hoping that, all this may well be your first book of this type, but it certainly won't be the last, especially when you may have retirement from your day job looming. You will have no excuse then not to continue your research and your photography and your writing and the various other things I know you are engaged with. So there'll be no excuse at all.
This is true.
I think what this actually proves, Phil, in the last 30 seconds that we've got here, is that we do live in a very strange and very paranormal world, and we need to get more information out. And as myself and you have discussed before, we do need more ladies involved with the subject as well. So, on behalf of myself, Adele, I'm going to thank you.
Thank you.
For joining us this evening on Inside the Outer Limits radio show. And I'm sure Philip would like to say good night.
Yes, a good evening from Yorkshire, Adele, and I dare say we will speak again.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
There we go, on time. Thank you, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Philip.
Bye-bye now.